Brett Cyphers, partner at Anfield Consulting, brings his vast experience in water district management to the podcast, where he sheds light on his role in permitting, restoration, and water quality improvements. We hope you enjoy.
In Our Expert Opinion podcast is brought to you by SVN Saunders Ralston Dancer Real Estate, a full-service land and commercial brokerage with almost $4 billion in transactions since 1996.
Anyways, welcome back to In Our Expert Opinion podcast. I am not going to be down about my co-host Chad Mills not being here today. He apparently had something scheduled that was more pressing or more important, and I called him and I was like almost in tears, and I was like, you're really not going to be there? And he was like, sorry, good luck. It was a 45-minute phone conversation, or 45-second phone conversation, but I do have Eli.
Howdy.
And I have another person in here who does not like the spotlight at all, and he will not be talking, so I won't call him out. And I have a really cool guest, Brett Cyphers with Anfield Consulting. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's great to be with you.
Thank you. We talked a little bit last night, and you were joking and said that your children thought that your job was just to be on the phone.
That's right, yeah.
I don't know that I know what your job is. I was telling our marketing manager, Jennifer, I was like, I don't know. Yeah. I don't know.
Well, in terms of what I do now, or in terms of what I did before, it's both. It's the same.
Yeah.
It's like I talk on the phone and go to meetings for a living. It's still the same. But I'm a lobbyist and consultant. We deal largely with environmental water resource issues. We represent the county that we're sitting in, and so we represent about 8 counties and 3 or 4 cities. But largely, it's my job consists of me working with clients to try to figure out what they need, and then going to whether it be agency folks or legislators and trying to get them to do what we want them to do.
What do you want them to do?
It depends on the day. Actually, sometimes it depends on the minute.
Okay.
In the case of, say, a place like Polk County, there's a lot of folks live here now, a lot of needs. When you look at year to year, there's something called the Heartland. Oh, gosh, I'm going to screw this up. I forget the name of the term of art, but it's essentially a conglomeration of local governments and the county itself to try to work on water resources and make sure that we have enough to support growth. And so we've got to go to legislators and the governor and these agencies and work on making sure they get those dollars.
So how does that, I still don't understand how these water management districts work.
Sure.
They're controlling, or are they trying to control? Are they controlling at all? I don't know. What are they doing?
They are all of those things that you just said they're doing. And so, yeah, that was a good answer. Good answer. So essentially, water management districts are kind of quasi-state agencies. The boards are appointed by the governor. They're confirmed by the state senate. The same way other agency heads are. The executive directors are technically hired by the boards, but the governor has to approve them.
Okay.
And they're also confirmed by the Senate. And so they're governed by different chapters of statute. Largely, it's Chapter 373. And what they're supposed to do is essentially 4 different things. Flood protection is a big one.
Okay.
That's how they came to be, certainly down here to begin with, was to deal with flood protection. Water quantity, which is what I was mentioning before when you talk about the Heartland headwaters, is making sure you have enough water to go around. Water quality, which is dealing with the things that everyone's talking about these days.
Microplastics.
It can be microplastics. It can be too much nitrogen or phosphorus in the water, all sorts of things. In many cases, it's the nitrogen and phosphorus causing algal blooms and things like that. And then you have natural systems, which is the things that a lack of water quantity or decreased water quality can have an impact on. And those are places like Indian River Lagoon, Biscayne Bay, Lake Parker, it could be here. And so that's their job. How they do that is through the law and then rules that come as a part of those laws existing.
So in terms of real estate,
Mm-hmm.
so this is a real estate pod. So,
Yeah.
but I mean, how does that affect development? And I know a couple of the brokers here have worked with SwiftMud. Maybe they've sold property for them, or I don't even know what all they do.
Yeah, I think when you look at, there's a couple of avenues that someplace like SVN can have a relationship with the district. One is through what's called the environmental resource permitting process. If you want to build a neighborhood, you want to build a building like this or a Chili's or a Red Lobster, you've got to get an environmental resource permit. That's to make sure that you store enough water, because you're putting in impervious surface, concrete and asphalt and things like that. You don't want too much water to go in your next door neighbor and flood them out. You also don't want to give decreased water quality into water bodies like the Peace River, Alafaya, Hillsborough, places like that. And so you have to get this permit to deal with that. And that includes dealing with engineers and then also the environmental science side of things. And so when you're building a new development, you've got to work with the district to make sure that you're not having those negative impacts.
Yeah. And so I had Robert Angus Williams on the podcast. You know him?
I know him well.
That's funny. We had him on, I want to say it was like last week. And so we were talking a little bit about watershed and, how you can't really like affect the flow of water on land and, how that could affect neighbors. Are often worried that new development will flood them or prevent them from getting water.
Right.
So, I mean, these districts, they're creating statutes, law, policy, just to kind of manage or control, what can and can't be done there?
Absolutely. Well, there are laws that kind of govern in an umbrella sense, and then you have individual rules at water management districts. However, there's now a new statewide stormwater rule that deals with some of these things, especially in terms of dealing with water quality issues. And that is actually up for ratification right now in the Florida legislature. It doesn't seem to be doing so well at the moment, but it is a rule that's already been drafted. And so the assumption is that at some point, either through negotiation or lawsuit arguments, things that Robert does for a living, can get to a conclusion where they settle on this rule. And then from that rule, that will govern how water management districts control that process from then on.
How does one get into water?
Well, for me, it was by accident.
Yeah.
I grew up in...
Did you fall into the water?
Well, many times. And metaphorically speaking, many times. When you grow up in Hillsborough County, you know very much about the water wars, and that's the Pinellas, Pasco, Hillsborough war over a limited amount of groundwater, because when you overpump it, they were pumping lakes and wetlands and things like that dry. And that's in Pasco County, which is not a good thing.
Yeah.
And so I was aware of it, but my first job in the legislature was in the Senate doing reapportionment. That's where they redistrict all the Senate districts and House districts based on changing population from the census. And so I did that for a little while, and then I went into working for a state senator back in Hillsborough County. And we dealt with some of those issues. Again, we had dry wetlands in Pasco, and that was part of his district. But then I got a call one day from a friend that I was in reapportionment with, and he says, "Brett, I want you to come work for Governor Bush." And I said, "That's cool. I don't know what you do for Governor Bush, because we hang out. We ate breakfast together, we ate lunch together, we worked together." I had no earthly idea what he actually did for the governor's office. And he says, "That's no problem," and he hands me a stack of Florida statutes, Chapter 373 of Florida statute, Chapter 403 of Florida statute, and then the Model Water Code from the early 70s, and said, "Just go ahead and read these. You start in 2 weeks." And so I did. And it was dealing with a lot of folks who knew more than I did for a long time, asking them.
That's my everyday.
Yeah. It still is. I try to listen more than I talk.
I don't.
But it's funny. I have my podcast is largely from people that help teach me about water and environmental issues over the years. And so
what's your podcast name?
it's called Water for Fighting.
Yes.
Kind of like the Mark Twain quote.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, I'm sorry, back to,
Yep.
so you started working for Governor Bush in what capacity?
I was an analyst, policy and budget analyst, and so I had to analyze all of the water management districts' budgets. There are 5 water management districts, and so I would go through their budgets and I would brief the governor on those, and he would make decisions on whether he liked it or not. And I would also do analyses on legislation that they were talking about, and then I would write basically just the facts, and then he would say, I don't like that, write a veto letter, or he'd say, sure, and he would sign it. That's basically what I did. I mean, nothing special about it. I loved working for the governor's office, but it was not glamorous work. They used to call it the sweatshop.
Yeah.
And it was for a reason.
Did you ever watch Julia Louis-Dreyfus show, Veep?
Mm-mm.
A lot of shenanigans, but
Okay.
I can just imagine a lot of people running around all the time, like actually running.
There is surprisingly little running, but when I say it, and a lot of people assume that things there like the West Wing or something like that.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it has elements of that.
Yeah.
But it's largely a bunch of nerds sitting in front of computers, running through spreadsheets. That's kind of the deal.
Oh dear. Well, that's I would say that's a lot like this building, but. Okay, interesting. So then you were writing these, facts or giving the governor facts, and then, but that had to do with, you said policy and budget.
Right.
Was that for the whole?
The first time, it was the entire state, but it was only for water. So
Okay.
things related to water management districts or things you could tie directly to some water issue. So there was some overlap there was another analyst that did DEP, another one that did Fish and Wildlife, another one that did Department of Agriculture, et cetera. And so wherever those things met, obviously you worked with other folks. It was
Yeah.
the second time I worked in the governor's office that I had all of the responsibility for all of those areas.
Okay. So they had like 5 people doing something, and then it was just you.
Well, I mean, at the time, the guy that talked me into going to the governor's office was my boss.
The second time around.
No, the first time around.
okay,
He was
okay.
my boss, and then I ended up with his job later on. 'Cause
Okay.
He went on to, suffer somewhere else, and and I got to take it. But
Yeah. We all suffer. But okay, interesting. So yeah, you kind of did just fall right into that. But you've been kind of in these roles for how long now?
21 years,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah. So you really made a career out of it. So I guess you like it.
I love it, and it's one of those things where you find something that you're enjoying, and then
Yeah.
just work until you get good at it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I've done, and someday I hope to get good at it. So.
Well, actually, when we were talking earlier, or yesterday, I feel like people keep asking you to come work with them, or for them, or for somebody else. So I think you can count yourself as pretty good at what you do, because nobody's asked. I've had to beg for every job I've ever gotten. Nobody has been like, I think you're really great, and come work for us. But that's sort of what's going on with you, is that you keep getting pulled into these positions where people like really need your expertise. So I don't know, give yourself a pat on the back for that.
Well, I appreciate it. I think it may have been more closer to, Brett will try anything. And so it's like no one else wants to. It's like, hey, Brett will do it. It's like, just give him a call.
Oh my God.
And after a while, just do that. It's like, it was, there's a lot to that though. It's like,
Yeah.
I always liked, the next, mountain to climb, or
Yeah.
some other goofy metaphor about, new challenge.
Yeah.
But I always like the idea of trying something new. It's nerve-wracking at first for me, but I enjoy the challenge in the end. And so,
Yeah.
So yeah, but also, if you're terrible at it, they ask you to stop coming to work. But so in that regard, it went okay.
Yeah. But I feel like you've also kind of keep going back to Tallahassee as well. Just from talking, you were saying that you grew up in Polk and Hillsborough, and then kind of bounced back,
Yeah.
went to Tallahassee, came back, went back to Tallahassee, and now I think you are there.
Yeah, we've been there permanently since 2007,
Okay.
2008, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
And and that was largely revolved around my oldest daughter. She was here in Tampa, and so I liked finding a way to be here. But then there's the opportunities always tend to pull you to Tallahassee, and so it just meant commuting on weekends and that sort of thing. So you do what you have to do, and then she grows up, and then you're a little bit freer, and then you start you extend your family a little bit more, and she has 2 sisters now. And so we can stay in Tallahassee and kind of make a home of it, but it was never really home until then.
Yeah. And so whenever you are in these positions dealing with water districts or just water in general, I know that it is important because Robert Williams told me that it was, but he said that something about the Florida aquifer is like not that low or like below the ground or something.
Right.
So that basically like if you throw something into the water, it'll just magically be in the water fairly quickly.
He's right. In most cases, when you get close to the coast, especially the west central coast of Florida, you get a lot of sandy soil, and so when sand just means that things move through quick, and it's you have depending on where you are, you have different kinds of aquifers, but largely the biggest, most productive one is the Floridan aquifer. In some places, very near the surface. But when you have things like limestone and sand that overtop, where the water is, it's easy to get water back into it, which is great when you have a state that's so enormous in terms of population. But it's also terrible when you have pollutants that go into it, and so that's the rub.
Can you walk me through, like, who is your typical client?
Well, we have 2 types of clients. We have government clients, and those are usually counties.
Okay.
And then the other type of client, largely, they're private companies. Many of them are engineering firms who build all sorts of things: roads, buildings, water infrastructure, resiliency infrastructure, things like that. And so it's a full spectrum. You have other private clients who do wetland restoration. We have a few of those. And then some that do seagrass restoration, that actually develop new strains of seagrass that can survive in these weird circumstances. In tougher circumstances with amazing results. And so we're lucky, and I'm lucky, to be able to work with folks who are trying to solve the problems that Florida faces in terms of water quality and the water quantity issues. So it's kind of like what I did before, which is you're serving, but it's a slightly different way. But the goal is the same in the end. I end up working with the same people I did before. They just know that that I'm a dirty lobbyist now, not just their friend. So
now you've got like the inside scoop though, so you can predict their move.
Right, and that's why people hire us, because they know that we understand the insides of these organizations.
Yeah.
So.
And so when they're coming to you and they want, I guess, so you're going to, who are you going to? Like whenever you're saying that you're lobbying for your clients, are you going to the person that
Sure.
is in your?
I'll give you an example. On my way down here, I stopped in Live Oak. Live Oak is where it's the headquarters of the Swanee River Water Management District. The executive director there, his name is Hugh Thomas, wonderful human being. Well, I've known Hugh for quite a number of years now, and he and I worked together when I was at the Northwest Florida Water Management District. Well, I have a client who wants to help them solve their water quantity and their water quality issues.
Okay.
You've got a lot of taxing uses of that water in that region, and it comes from a bunch of different places. But the folks that I now work for, want to help. But sometimes folks need to be convinced that these are the right folks that have the right answers. And so we met up together for lunch, and I talked about making sure I'm trying to find the nexus between what my client does and what Hugh needs and that board needs in Swanee, and largely that's the rub. Is first you convince somebody, then you have to figure out how to pay for it, because everything comes down to money when it comes to these types of projects. So.
And so I would imagine in Florida that there is a ton of money being put into these water districts, but I could be very wrong about that. But I would think that because we're surrounded by water, well, only on 3 sides, but that would be like a major, expense for Florida.
It is. I think you touched, sort of on a couple of different points there, which is we're surrounded by water, but it's not cheap water. The cheap water is the water that's underneath our feet that you don't have to treat as much. It's easy to get. It's easy to get out of the ground. It's easy to treat for human consumption and deliver. And so that's the cheap water. When it gets more expensive is when you have to pull it off a surface water body, say a reservoir, or if you have to go even farther than that and desalinate that water like you have in southern Hillsborough County along the coast.
Okay.
That's expensive to do, but in some cases it's necessary.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially in Hillsborough. So then after you convince these people to date and work together, is your job done?
It is not done.
Okay.
Then it's the paying for it part. And that's the thing is, and you touch on the other issue of, hey, water management districts have a lot of money, and when you compare it to you and me, yes, they have a whole lot of money. When it's compared to the need, sometimes though, it's not enough.
Yeah.
Swiftmud's a good example of a water management district that has planned for the future the best they can, and they've set aside what they used to call the financial engine to pay for their cooperative funding program, which is really clever. It's a clever way of trying to figure out ways to pay for half, to work with Polk County, with that Heartland Alliance, or the Polk Region Water Cooperative, to develop these projects, to do, which is great. But you have a place like where Hugh Thomas is in Suwannee, or where I was in Northwest, the revenue is much smaller because there's not as much taxable value to the property up there.
Okay.
And the millage rates are much smaller. In Northwest, the millage rate is held to 0.05 mils, rather than the usual constitutional cap of 1 mil. Not that Swiftmud or somebody else is collecting a mill. They're certainly not. But that's what they have the access to. And so in Suwannee's a much smaller district. We're a smaller district in Northwest. So it makes it harder to accomplish big, giant projects. When you look at South Florida Water Management District, huge property values. The millage is healthy enough to produce what to you and I might look like an incredibly large amount of money. But when you look at the things that they need to accomplish, doing Everglades restoration, Lake Okeechobee, Kissimmee River restoration, Biscayne Bay, you name it, those are the things on Drew Bartlett's plate down there, and he's the executive director at South Florida. They have a lot of money, but they don't have enough to accomplish all that.
You had mentioned that these water management districts have a lot of money. How do these districts get funded? If that makes sense. No,
that makes perfect sense. The baseline revenue source for most water management districts is ad valorem taxes. So you pay up to 1 mil means $1 per thousand of taxable value on a home or a building or something like that. So you take all that together based on the millage rate, multiply, by the number of folks that you have, and you come up with that revenue. So Southwest Florida Water Management District, that's a huge part of the revenue base. With Suwannee River Water Management District, it's the same. St. John's River Water Management District, the same. In Northwest, it gets a little bit tricky because the ad valorem was squeezed down in the Constitution so low. And so where it sits is probably about 0.03 mils right now, which means you get about, last time I did the budget, about $4 million. The district's budget in Northwest is about $110 million. Wow. And so the rest of that, you're like, hey, my math says that you're not collecting at all.
Yeah, that's a lot of money.
And so in Northwest, you would go to the legislature, and they do. The legislature supports its permitting program. They support operations. They support its minimum flow and minimum level program, which is to help get the water back into to springs and the aquifer. And so all those things put together, including some federal sources and even timber sales. The district has lands that it's restoring, and so you have pine trees that may be sand pine or loblolly, and they should have long leaf pine there. And so when you restore it, you can sell that timber over time. And so that's even a portion of that. So put all that together and you come up with, about $110 million, and you cobble that budget together. But then again, you look at the broader needs out there. Sometimes it's a question of speed, and there's only so much you can accomplish with the sophistication that you have. But if you expand your ability to have folks help you do that, I think that's what a lot of people like Northwest and Suwannee do. Even the big districts use folks that contract with to help them accomplish these big projects. And so that's what you do. But when you look at these big, hairy, challenges out there, like the blue-green algae, a friend of mine called it, I think he's coined the phrase, the guacamole algae, down in Southeast Florida. And it's a mess, but you've got to, we know how to fix it. Folks have studied it and done all sorts of things, and they're passing, they have legislation in the legislature right now to even extend that and accelerate some of that improvement, but the expenses there are immense.
Yeah, well, I mean, the ocean is immense, so I can imagine that it would take a lot of resources in order to counteract, these blooms or whatever you want to call them. But
right.
Ugh.
When you have to look at the causes of the blooms, and they're the causes are various and sundry. We like putting fertilizer and water on our lawns, and if you put too much in it and it runs off, it goes into water bodies. If you have a septic tank, and we have 2.5 million septic tanks in the state of Florida right now, and each one of those, depending on where it is, can put nitrogen and other not awesome things in the water, whether it be the groundwater or even it makes its way into some of these surface water bodies. And so groundwater makes its way up into springs, which feeds rivers. It gets into lakes, and it also gets into these coastal estuaries and places like that. And so they're looking at it right now. I think you have a series of governors and a legislature that is keen to fix those problems and to make up, maybe, I wouldn't call it neglect, but I would just, I would call it kind of missing the mark a little bit well in the past, and trying to catch up to that now fast enough with limited resources. I mean, there are folks that you need to help pay for Medicaid and kids to go to school and for new roads and all that kind of thing. What my job is, and what my partners and I do, is try to make the case that maybe the distribution maybe lean a little bit more toward the water and environment to speed up that restoration process.
I don't think that I've ever realized, how much government is in water and, regulating it and making sure that it's okay for us, and that, we can have enough orange groves, and this, it's in everything.
I'd call it a good problem to have. You have a lot of places where you have, if they have an aquifer, and they have some in, say, northern Texas into Oklahoma, but they are prehistoric, and so the water in it is finite in many cases because it's kind of sealed in and old. I talk to geologists that try to explain it, and then I get to, okay, so it's a bubble in there, and you can't get any more than what's in there because it doesn't recharge the way that Florida does. You have other places in out west where they fight. That's, I think, where the water for fighting nomenclature comes from, is places out there where they're damming and moving water, not just for public consumption, but for power creation and things like that. But that creates a lot of strain on the resource itself, but it also creates a lot of uncertainty in terms of what the future looks like. And so when you put places that in the middle of the desert that wouldn't exist but for taking that water and diverting it and using it that way, it gets complicated. So it's a good problem to have. We have a lot of recharges, a ton of, there's a whole bunch of water. The problem is people really like Florida, and they want to live here, and that's great.
If Gary Ralston was in here, he'd be able to tell you the exact body count that is moving into Florida per day or per hour or per week, whatever it is.
I believe it's over 1,000 per day.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
I believe you.
I mean, as a point of reference, when I worked for the Southwest Florida Water Management District, my area of responsibility was Polk, Harding, Highlands County. And I worked out of the Bartow office. When I worked there and I left in 2007 to go back to Tallahassee, the population of Polk County, I think, was just under 500,000 people. It's now, I believe, over 700,000. Is that right? 750,000 people. It's
yeah, it's up there.
And people love it. And
I know.
And in some ways, we get nostalgic for places. I know we talked to Dean earlier, and his family being, from Claremont, and Claremont it used to be all orange trees, and it is not all orange trees anymore. And that part of the county is just blowing up.
I know.
And so, I mean, you get nostalgic, but at the same time, we moved here, my family moved here. They were both Navy brats, both my parents. And so their parents, after the war, the big war, moved to Florida on Jacksonville and Merritt Island. And so when my parents got married up in Virginia, they moved down to Florida, as one does in the late 60s, early 70s.
Absolutely.
And, yeah.
Florida's the place to be.
Yeah.
Still is. I think it always has been. Okay, well, can you drop any more wisdom or, anything we should know, anything we should be scared about? Because I really like to read about things at night that get me amped up,
What about your podcast? Why do you do your podcast?
I'm glad you asked that, and I get asked. Here's the long answer is a long winding story about how some reporter mistreated me once, and I don't want to. Oh my gosh!
Say the name. Just blast them.
In fact, I'm not sure I remember her. I think it's.
It was a her.
It was a her. Let me give you an example, because it'll give you an idea of how environmental agencies work together, other state agencies work together to a good end, and how that good end gets punished. And so I worked with the Water Management District. There was a subcontractor. This is not DOT, but a subcontractor. DOT was doing a road job. They were screwing it up, but royal. And they were putting silt. Basically, you have to prevent, remember we talked about the ERP process before. You can't let too much water go onto someone else's property. And under construction, you can't let turbid water leave. And so you'll see things that look like plastic sheeting kind of fences. And so that silt fencing, helps keep that in there. Well, theirs was failing, and the construction site was not well managed. And so DEP was involved. We were involved. DOT was not happy with their contractor. We worked with other, local governments, and so we're out there. We're trying to figure out how to fix this. The contractor's in trouble. They're going to have to pay a penalty. They're going to have to fix it, and they're going to have to remediate if there's a problem that they caused in that water body. Well, I go to a public meeting, and I say these with the folks that I work with at DOT, who've been great to work with. Out of that district office. And the reporter's there, and she says, "Hey, can I call you sometime to talk about this?" I said, "Sure, anytime you want." Well, anytime was, I think it was a Sunday afternoon. I spent 45 minutes on the phone with her explaining every last detail of the problem, what we were going to do to fix it, things in the future that we were working on that weren't directly related to this, but were good for water quality in general in that bayou. And she says, "But is it toxic? Is it dangerous to people?" I said, "No, it's not. It's dirt. So it's not poisonous, but it is bad for the seagrass bed. It's bad for invertebrates. It's bad for the things that eat invertebrates. It's bad news, and they're going to have to fix it." It's like, "But no, it's not. It's not toxic." Headline comes out, I think it was 3-4 days later, says, district director says, "Don't worry, it's just dirt." And I said, that's what we took out of 45 minutes of talking together. And so I called her and I said, "Never call me again.
Don't ever darken my door again."
I said, I will answer any question you ever have in writing, but don't ever call me again. And so the podcast was, if you've done this long enough, and I know that even, having been in the legislature a shorter period of time, you get interviewed, they write articles about you, and you talk with somebody, you go on TV, you do things like this, and they put 2 sentences in print. That's just how it is. And then they write the story they want to write, or they say something completely out of context, and that you intended to be the exact opposite of how they wrote it. And I didn't want that to happen. And so when I thought about all these people that are really spent decades of their lives that work night and day, many of them work really, really hard to try to do their best to protect these resources, to serve Floridians, to solve problems. And the only thing that people know about them is what they read about in a newspaper.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's okay, and many times, it's not. And so I created the podcast to give people a chance to tell me and tell listeners what they think about something, why they do it, and what they did, and how they want it to be. They don't have me to filter it or edit it, or somebody else to say, nope, we're going to cut all that out and just leave this thing where somehow I make it sound like you said, terrible things about the governor or something.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the genesis of it. And the other part is just to kind of serve as a oral history of sorts, which is kind of piecing together people's stories so other people can understand, the ones that are interested in that kind of thing. And it's a niche audience,
Yeah.
but for people interested in that, it's kind of an idea, like how to piece together, what we did to get to where we are.
Yeah. No, I think it's important to so many Floridians,
Mm-hmm.
new Floridians, old Floridians. I think it's really, really important to our farmers, our ag, rec, property owners, buyers. So we'll be sure to tell them to listen to your podcast.
Great.
It's called Water.
Water for Fighting.
Yes. Okay, perfect.
Look for the old-timey hand pump on
Okay,
the cover.
perfect. I
Yeah.
love that. Okay, Eli, thanks for jumping in today.
I did my best.
I know, you did really great. Thank you. No shout out to Chad,
Sorry, Chad.
but shout out to Michael, even though he was absent, but that's okay.
He's in the know.
Thank you, Brett.
Thank you so much. Great time.